Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm very excited to be here today with Dr. Eric Adler, who's professor of medicine at UC San Diego, as well as chief medical officer and head of research at Lexeo Therapeutics. Eric, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, nice to be here.
For people who aren't familiar with your work, I'd love if you could just give an overview of some of the work you've done at UCSD over the past decade or so, and how that transitioned to Lexeo and what you're doing today.
Sure. So I'm a physician scientist and a cardiologist who's really spent the last 2 decades focused on the care of patients with cardiomyopathy or disease of heart muscle, and all stages of that, like from first presentation through requiring heart transplant or end of life care. And at the same time, I'm a scientist who's had a laboratory again for around 2 decades or so in understanding the underpinnings of cardiomyopathy and looking at novel strategies for treating it. So I have this kind of relationship between the bench and the bedside where I see patients and I'm inspired by the unmet needs that are, recognized in my, rounding and clinics, and then go back to the lab and try to think about how to creatively solve for problems. Principally, that was initially around my postdoctoral work in stem cell biology, embryonic stem cell biology. So a lot of the work initially in my training was around regenerative therapy, and at that time, pluripotent stem cell technology was just being developed, and where most of the focus was on regeneration, I started to work with and think about pluripotent stem cells as a tool to model rare disease. So, I was basically going around seeing patients with a skin biotome and making stem cells from the patient's skin, turning them into cardiomyocytes based on work, and then studying diseases because I thought, and I wasn't obviously the only one, but saw this as a unprecedented opportunity to observe human disease in the dish. And there's this fundamental concept that animal models don't really fully recapitulate human disease despite best efforts. So here we had this opportunity to do that. And in studying these diseases, it naturally portends to studying genetic disease because those are the best recapitulated in the dish. And so starting to amass loads of pluripotent stem cells in my freezer, my lab, doing work on describing these model systems, and the story that really kind of the pivot for me was about 10 years ago when I started. I saw several patients enroll with a disease called Danon disease. They were misdiagnosed, and in fact, I didn't think the patients had Danon when I made their stem cells. They were diagnosed with Fabry disease and Pompe disease, these other diseases, and then we were making the stem cells from them and then sequencing and realizing that they actually had Danon. And so I started studying Danon disease in the dish, and this is when it was really a journey for me into working with rare disease populations, because as I was studying them and publishing a little bit, patients started reaching out to me like, I had a patient I'll remember that flew to me from New Jersey to San Diego, just him and his parents, like, can you help us? And that was like a
Right.
very striking thing for me because I didn't have anything to offer. I wasn't even published, I wasn't ever pretending to
Right.
have a therapy. I was just, and they're like, no one is studying this. Like, we're so grateful. Like, take our cells, take our kids' cells, like, take our money, do anything. And that was like a real game changer for me. So we started ramping up what we were doing in Danon, and eventually, again, a little bit of luck or stumbled into it. We were having trouble getting good controls for our experiments in Danon disease, to understand the phenotypes in the dish. So, editors were giving us a hard time, like, you don't have a good control, like, you need to repair the mutation. You can't just use the normal cell. We weren't good. So we started using lentiviral and AAV vectors as controls for our experiments. And so we were infecting these iPS cells with viral vectors. And then we had this aha moment. There's someone here that was doing Kirk Hammond, who was doing gene therapy at UCSD, who was helping us with these viral vectors. And then there was a clinical fellow in my lab, and some other fellows, a guy named Brad Nelson. Other people were all sitting around, and we were Shireen Hashem, a PhD. Like, these controls are really great. These cells are like normal. And then we're like, wait, why don't we just develop a therapy? So
Right.
we started, we you get to this point where, like, academically, you're focused on your grants. So this whole time I'm writing NIH grants, trying to get argue with reviewers about the importance of these mechanisms, and understanding autophagy, which is important, Danon and LAMP signaling, all these things, and using these controls. We're like, wait, we actually have a therapy. Like, let's be translational here and pivot to being translational. And so that opened my eyes to the potential, really, of gene therapy for rare cardiovascular disease. Like, if you have a loss of function mutation, why not use gene therapy to replace that? And that was really um, catalyzed by, AAVs now, especially AAV9. I'd been working I'd done trials with AAV1, AAV2 in my clinical world, working with different companies and investigators with lentes, adenoviruses, AAVs. None of them really transduced the heart all that well. We knew that. Now AAV9 in our models, in our mice, in our cells, was transducing cardiomyocytes. But now you had this ability to deliver precision therapies to a heart cell. Um, Heart cells don't divide that much. That's a negative thing. Like, that's why we try to eat healthy, avoid cocaine,
Right.
avoid things that kill
Right.
cardiomyocytes. The advantage is that they don't divide much. If you get an adeno-associated virus in there, it's going to stick around. It's not like,
Yeah.
liver cells, other things, gut cells. So, you're looking at a turnover rate as low as 0.03 to zero point 0.3, like, they don't divide. So that was this advantageous biological fact that we were working with. And so made that, worked with industry, and developed gene therapy for Danon. At that same time, I had mentioned at the beginning, I was stocking a lot of different patients now with different mutations, and was realizing, and not the first person, I'm not claiming, but there's a lot of undiagnosed genetic cardiomyopathy. A lot of patients are called, they present with heart failure. Remember, heart failure is a leading cause of morbidity and mortality in the United States. And they often came to me when it was already, frankly, too late. They needed heart transplants. But when you looked, these patients were called idiopathic cardiomyopathy, like, which is just doctors convincing patients that they had a fancy name for something they didn't know. Use the
It
word
means we don't know
idiopathic.
in fancy. Yeah.
Yeah, my daughter, when she was 9, she overheard me and she's like, "Oh, you mean idiopathic, don't you?" I'm like, "Yeah, I guess we do." uh, so uh, the bottom line here is that I started, was really now rigorously genetically testing almost all my patients that I could, that there was a good reason, any family history, idiopathic, finding lots of genetic mutations, and now making iPS cells from these patients, making mouse models from these patients, understanding compound disease. This was all academic at the time, um, but became clear, and I'm sure you appreciate this, like academia is built for depth and for asking interesting and solving interesting questions. It's like a really important piece, but it's not built for speed and it's
Yeah.
not built for translation right now. So now we're starting to develop new therapies besides Danon for other diseases and working with colleagues of mine at UCSD. And we're like, wow, we're sitting on multiple other genetic therapies like you're hoping that Danon was just the tip of the iceberg for precision medicine for heart failure. So that's, led me to collaborating with Lexeo, collaborated with them for about a year. And then I really wanted to follow the science and follow the translation. And it became clear that for me to do that, I needed to start working more directly with Lexeo. And it took this role at Lexeo as well.
What is it to help people who aren't in the genetics of cardiomyopathy world?
Yeah.
How early do you need to be treating in these cases? Like in Danon disease, for example, I think the life expectancy of a male is 19 or 20 years old, right? And
Yeah.
is that an exceptional case? Some of them don't show up until much later in life, but my guess
Yes.
is that you want to treat as early as possible, right? So screening, like you talked about, is important.
Well, I think it's a bit of a Goldilocks phenomena currently, where maybe, Danon is rare in that the penetrance is so high. Like if you have the gene, you're going to get the disease. But a lot of these genetic mutations increase risk dramatically, but they don't have a full penetrance. And, given there's no free lunch when it comes to getting the medicine and the cost and risk, et cetera. So I think you want to wait till you have evidence that patients have some disease for sure. At this point, that might change. Like if I'd love a future world where these are truly vaccines, where you're at risk, just like you're at risk for getting the flu, you're going to get a vaccination to prevent you from getting a genetic myopathy. But I think in today's, where we are today, is that you should have probably evidence of these whatever genetic mutation leading to heart failure, or at least some structural change or functional change in your heart. But obviously, what I think is intuitive, though we don't know with certitude, is that once the heart becomes very fibrosed, so you're replacing muscle with scar, delivering precision therapies, one of my mentors once said, dead meat don't beat, like once you have a bunch of scar, it's a brutal way
Yeah,
of saying it. But like, we say,
past the
and
point of
there's
no
different,
return. Yeah.
yeah, probably. And then, let's, then we're thinking about medicines, frankly, heart transplantation, mechanical support, things like that.
If we zoom out a little more widely in cardiovascular disease and heart failure, besides these rare but very severe genetic conditions, there's also a lot of gene environment interplay. We did a journal club recently on looking at polygenic scores that result in
Yeah,
cardiomyopathies, but even beyond that, we have heart failure for not because of cardiomyopathies, but coronary artery disease or other kinds of focuses.
sure.
I'd love to just get your perspective on what the big challenges are in cardiovascular medicine more broadly, because it's one of the areas of health that hasn't been trending the right direction, right? Cardiometabolic disease is going the opposite
Yeah,
direction that we need it to go.
it's it's um it's going in the opposite direction in multiple ways. So we made a lot of strides in the treatment of cardiovascular disease between, I would say, the early 80s and the first decade or so of this century, in that understanding the pathogenesis of um, coronary disease, these acquired risks that you have, whether that's smoking, the high cholesterol, the cholesterol hypothesis, and developing two things: public health measures. Um, I think we like to take credit, but honestly, the recognition and improvements in the use of tobacco have had the biggest impact, no doubt.
Right.
Banning cigarettes in bars by Michael Bloomberg, all these things, these trickle down effects, right? We all grew up, or I grew up, maybe even you leave a bar smelling like smoke, you stop doing that, right? And so that had a huge impact. And then remember in the 80s, the treatment of coronary disease was if you had a heart attack, you sat in a dark room and you got an aspirin. Like that's what we knew. And you were told not to disturb the patient, they would just die in a room. So now we knew to open arteries, all these amazing things. You had development of thrombolytics to treat coronary disease. You have medicines to treat high cholesterol. You have improvements in what we understand about the cholesterol hypothesis and people avoiding that. Unfortunately, you have all this in the last, 15 years or so. It's become more over 20 years. We have crises in obesity. We recognize that a lot of the foods that we switched to from, though I think we were getting better about recognizing high cholesterol foods, we kind of missed the boat on recognizing the risks of diabetes and diets that increase risk of diabetes. So you have this obesity epidemic and diabetes epidemic, which probably are as bad for you and bad for your heart. And there's some controversy about, what's worse, or, you have all these diets and unfortunately, preventive medicine is like years behind treatment. And that's a shame, but that's just, I think that's a structure of our biotech. And unfortunately, but we don't know a ton about nutritional science and stuff, but it's pretty clear that we have an obesity epidemic and that's causing a heart epidemic or contributing. So you have that component. And then unfortunately, you have this component of the increased use of drugs, alcohol, but, like methamphetamines, all these things in young people, which are like a formula for causing heart failure, adrenergic stimulus. And so, and funny, in my day job, I have this surreal thing where you see patients dying from methamphetamine, who need a heart transplant from methamphetamine use. And then you see the donor heart from someone who died from opioid use. We have this opioid methamphetamine like
Right.
circle
Loop.
going
Yeah,
on in the
that's
United States.
terrible.
No one, yeah, like people, we're doing more heart transplants than ever. That's not a good barometer of a society. It's a bad
No.
barometer, right? But now getting to so you have this going on and you can see it. Not only is heart disease getting worse, we're losing strides, but it's getting worse in young people. So now you're seeing disease in 30, 40, 20-year-olds. It's going up. Heart failure specifically is going up in these younger generations.
Why is that
I
happening?
think I think some of it is obesity and drug use, for sure. We're not entirely sure, to be honest. That's the easy, low-hanging fruit. You mentioned polygenic scores. I think that I look at all of the, and the way I talk about this with patients is we all have it's like poker. We all have our hand that we're dealt. And some hands are worse than others. If Danon is like the worst hand you could be dealt, or, Huntington's, Duchenne, whatever it is, Duchenne, all
Yeah.
these terrible. A lot of us are dealt, even maybe you and I have, genetic variants that put us at risk. If you're living a fully healthy life and you're not exposed to other risk, you would never notice, your heart may be at, you might be at particular risk, be like your house being at risk, for something like a burglary or something, but you have open doors, whatever, but just doesn't happen. But now you add that genetic risk, which I think is considerable, 20%. When we look at, UK biobanks and comments, it's
Yeah.
staggering how many patients have some kind of genetic variant that don't get disease. And I see siblings where one does and one doesn't. But, then you add on whether that's, diet, exercise, stress, other things, coronary disease, right? I think some people have heart attacks and recover, and some people have mild heart
Right.
attacks, and you're like, this doesn't make sense. So I think it's this combination of things. And, there's issues with access to care and not treating hypertension and things. And then the last layer, which is there's distrust in doctors now, right? There's this like this, and I don't know, this is a problem that keeps me up a little bit, is that patients frankly are looking to alternative sources, which is fine. But sometimes those alternative sources are giving them advice like, oh, you shouldn't take a statin. You shouldn't take ibuprofen. You shouldn't take a vaccine.
Right.
One of the surreal moments I think about is a patient that came to me for a cardiac gene therapy trial, and I went through an hour of consent and all the risks. I'm giving you a gene. I'm going to change your gene in your body. It could cause risks and these adverse events. And yes, 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 yes. And we're going through the checklist, and I'm going to say, oh, by the way, you need to get your COVID vaccine quickly before we do this. Say, oh, I'm not having anyone change my genes. Like, wait, I am changing your genes. Oh no, I'm not taking that vaccine. It's going to change my genes. We just talked about this. You want, so they didn't want to be, because there's this distrust of medicine. So that also younger people are not going, I hate to ask you, but I can tell you, many people your age or my age or younger don't even go see their doctor, right? They don't get primary prevention. They don't get, then they're watching podcasts, not like this one, but other, telling them to do all kinds of other stuff, and not trust
no
me.
medical advice being dispensed on this podcast, but
but so they're taking other medicines and having these different diets and things which are actually atherogenic and all kinds of problems. So,
do you think there's hope of that reversing, or is this something that is going to get worse before it gets better? Do you think?
I mean, I think we got to get our head, out of the sand or whatever it is, and meet patients where they are, take better, it's and this is important for developing novel therapies, right? Like if we develop these novel therapies and no one trusts and want to take it and doesn't trust, RNA therapeutics or gene therapeutics because they're listening on Twitter or whatever instead. So it's a real problem for innovative therapy, cancer therapeutics across. I think we have to meet people where they are and be more proactive in talking and being in social media and I think it's no surprise. Like I have 10 minutes with a patient when I'm in clinic to explain that they have heart failure, explain their the side effects of new therapies, all the trials, all that stuff.
Right.
They can spend 3 hours on a podcast, right? So we're being pressured to spend less time with our patients because, you build, the way the structure is and the more patients, whatever.
Yeah.
So we're not communicating with them. We're not seeing them as much. There are nefarious examples, right, where people are, it's easy to find examples of things where there's bad behavior or whether that's in pharma, medicine, the bad apples that you can own to. So we've got to address that. To me, it's a crisis that ignored our own peril. But you start to see the striking thing is, people are supposed to continue to live longer. Technology is supposed to make people live longer. In the US, the curve is going the other way. We have of this innovative therapy, amazing things like cancer is becoming chronic disease. We're curing, potential cures for GLP-1s. But instead, mortality, the lifespan is going down. To me, that's a bigger crisis. We talk about all these different crises, but that continues despite COVID, being past COVID, it was blamed on COVID, but that's not the blame anymore.
Yeah, that's not the issue anymore. That's right.
Yeah.
Not cardiovascular, but you talking about people having hesitation around getting new genes delivered to their body had me thinking about some of the other work that you do in Alzheimer's, where I suspect the conversations with patients it's even more emotionally charged in a sense, because you released data relatively recently where you're delivering ApoE2 into the brain using a gene therapy approach. And ApoE2 is the protective version of the variant. And on the one hand, it's a transformative approach, but people have a visceral reaction to something being delivered to their brain, right? So you probably had or the the other folks that you work with had a lot of those similar conversations of this is this is a very groundbreaking and new thing, but it's probably hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around initially.
I think actually and I'm sure, at least for me personally, so I'm speaking from that space, but the having a significantly increased risk of developing premature senility is one of the scariest things
Yeah.
anyone can face, right? Maybe more than death, right? Because now you're changing,
You're losing
senility
control.
changes your
Yeah.
identity. You lose your identity, you lose your autonomy, your like your definition of self, and you're a burden on other people, right? So now you're thinking about your family members. So I think that when people, and you're talking about this ApoE4 genetic variant, where we know that you're at the significantly 10 times, risk of premature Alzheimer's disease, right? We're all at risk for
Yeah.
Alzheimer's, but these are patients that are getting, you know, 40s, 50s, 60s. So these patients who are being diagnosed because of, you have the 23andMe's and, all these other, now, assuming that genetic testing becomes more widespread, now you're 35, 40 years old and you're looking, you got kids that are, 8 or 10, or maybe not, whatever, your career is blossoming. And all of a sudden you're looking at the risk of getting premature Alzheimer's. Uh, those patients are running to be in the trial. Actually, it's the other way. They're like, change my genes, whatever,
Yes.
cut off my leg.
Interesting.
Well, I will, whatever, like put a
Right.
needle in my spinal cord, like,
Stop
and
this
change
thing.
my
Yeah.
freaking genes. Like, and even then, you're not, those many ApoE4 patients, might not get it. And it's early days. But no,
Yeah.
I think this one specifically, um, especially if in patients with early evidence of disease, um, they're uh, they're willing to take some risk. Now, it needs to be with all gene therapy, and this included. Thankfully, we showed very low adverse events, and so we're not asking people to have a very high chance of something, because they're still
Yeah.
functioning now. So it's a trade-off for something that's not that is still early in development. But patients, this is a big problem. And remember, the antibody therapy for Alzheimer's has a black box. There was more bleeding with in these ApoE4 patients. So that though all those new therapies that are antibody based actually aren't indicated for the ApoE4
Yeah.
patients.
Do one of the things that I'm like getting loud and clear from talking to you actually is you have a very your approach is very much focused around starting from the perspective of the patients, more so than a lot of
Yeah,
people I think that spend their careers in drug development, or a big part of their careers in drug development. That's comes, I'm sure, from how much time you spent working directly with patients. Can you
yeah,
talk a little bit about that? How does that make the way that you develop therapeutics different than maybe other people who don't take that patient first, work
yeah. I
backwards
mean,
approach?
I think, well, there's two reasons. One is like it clearly brings me a lot of purpose, and and so it's the kind of wake up in the morning reason. I've been very
Yeah.
fortunate in being part of patients' journeys and helping them part of that. So that gives me a lot of joy and purpose. So I wouldn't, if it's for selfish reasons, like that's you know, because it's been highly satisfying. But I also think we need to solve for problems. And I think that's true for all innovation, like start with the problem and the unmet need at the level of, if you want to be total, who is going to be the person that's going to be using your product? It's the patient, right? So start with where they are and their journey and what's important to them, and solve for big, important problems. That just gives me a lot, makes it gives me a clear sense of purpose. It's not like trying to create a problem that's not there, or, you know, here's a cool tool. How do we figure out how to use it? Like, I think for me, at least, and that's just where I'm at. It's and frankly, like look at the Nobel Prizes in medicine. A lot of them or most of them are MDs who were, I bet you, if you push come to shove, inspired by patient interaction and seeing things. And so I think that's why it is. But ultimately, if the patients don't think it's a big problem, you might make a really nifty, therapy, and who cares,
Yeah. When you're designing clinical trials, how do you end up balancing the tensions that sometimes end up existing between running the most robust and perfect experiment that the clinical trial protocol or the regulators call for versus the patient experience? Because oftentimes those things come into come to a head, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I think, and I would expand upon it. Like, I think there's partnership in drug development, and the partnership is between obviously the company inventor, whoever it is, the patient, the regulator, and the investor, right? Especially in early biotech, right?
Yeah.
And when it comes together perfectly, it's like, I say it's joke, it's like making a movie. You have a producer, director, star, the
Yeah.
patient star, producer might be the VC
Right.
investor, we're the director, right? Comes to the regulators, or, I don't know, someone else in this, but when it comes together perfectly, everyone is aligned, and it's very it's magic, it's beautiful, and it works well. And most of the time that's the case. Like, if patient, as I mentioned in the very beginning of this, like patients with these rare, devastating cardiovascular disease, they're like, line me up,
Yeah.
biopsy my heart. You want me to move to San Diego for 4 months or whatever? Sign me up. Get me out of school. I quit my job. I'm doing a fundraiser. Not only am I doing it, but my church is supporting me. My family, I did a GoFundMe. I can think of stories that I'm getting emotional, where families made and their communities made huge sacrifices to be in it. And they're doing it. Some of them are doing it for others. Like,
Yeah.
they're like, oh, this isn't just me. Like, I've had patients, I'm working in a magenta cardiomyopathy now in trials and that. They're like, I'm okay, but I need to figure this out because my next generations, like, I want them to get therapy. So, yeah. Now, my job as the CMO role I have is a patient protector role, right? Like, because I want to look people in the face and say, I'm doing the right thing for you and not have any doubt. So I think there's some of that where, being transparent about risk. This is very important in gene therapy,
Yeah.
right? Like, transparent about risk, realistic about benefit, right? We think, and engendering trust from the beginning. The secret sauce to, execution is, you're in this world. Execution is the secret, is the difference between successful uh, um, biotechs and non-successful and successful pharma. Can you execute on your trials? And the secret sauce is finding the right investigator at the site. Because I've been both, so I think I have it, and making it so they have buy-in. They're going to advocate for their patient. They're going to help you design the trial. They know what's important, and the patient trusts their doctor. They don't
Yeah.
trust, they
Right.
don't have a reason to trust.
They don't
Oh, I
trust a
trust
website.
Lexeo.
Yeah.
I trust whatever. They don't
Right.
trust, yeah, anybody. I don't blame them. I don't. But, I know so and so for 5 years or 10 years. He takes care of my whole family. He wants me to be in this trial. And he looked me in the face and said, "This is right for me." So when you have partnership between there's not enough time, like, and not, it has to be done. But you can imagine, now you have the company, then you have the CROs, then you have the providers just become cogs in the wheel. That's not the way to do these things. Like, you have to have
Yeah.
relationships and find the right sites. This guy cares about patients. He's going to wake up at 2 a.m. when someone has and recognize it's an adverse event and get that patient to the hospital and not blow it off. Or he's going to, or she's going to make sure to actively try to enroll and find the patients and spend an hour. It sucks being an investigator. It's like a lot of time. You know how many signatures you have to do, how many things. You're not doing it for money or fame. Most, because it's not there, that's not really there in most of these trials, at least in the US, the universities and all these other things. That's where it goes. And then, you're one name on a trial with like 100 names. So
Yeah.
doing it because you believe in it and you want to change, you're excited to be innovative and change it. So finding those partners is the key.
You're so right about that. I'm just thinking back to a personal experience. My wife and I we had a challenging first pregnancy, and the
Mm.
neonatal prenatal doctor that we were working
Mm.
with was one of those kind of people where there's a particular decision we had to make with a particular timeline. And he said, I will be here until midnight tonight. Call me, make a
Yeah.
decision. If it's past that, call me anyways. I'll do it. And we would follow him anywhere, right? Because he didn't say, I'm done at 5 today. So let me know when the decision is
I
made. He
mean,
said, when you're ready,
listen,
I'm ready.
it's funny.
Yeah.
A lot of these conversations had come full circle that we've had today, but it's, I know thousands of doctors like that. And so to see at the same time where we've lost the trust, we used to be the most trusted profession by far.
Right.
And because
That's
we
such a
wake
good
up in the
point.
middle of the day and making all these sacrifices and all this stuff and less sleep, less time with family,
Yeah.
all that stuff. And so to see now, like kind of see the field is a little bit under assault where in some ways. So I don't know how, getting back to what we said earlier, but yeah, so but the bottom line is, yeah, finding those kind of people who have the relationships. And there's many patients, especially the rare disease community, which I'm in. When a rare disease patient, it takes them sometimes 8 years to find a doctor who
Right.
just diagnoses them, right? And cares about them. So they've already shopped around and they've been blown off and been called hysterical and called crazy and called depressive and man, oh, you don't have heart failure, you have
Difficult.
anxiety,
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah, yeah. So when they find that doctor that they trust, who, and I can think of a lot of them, those are the part, they will do anything and as they should, because so those are the partners you want to have. And then it's this beautiful Oscar-winning movie, right? It's like
Yeah.
you put it together, you
Sometimes
make a
sometimes
medicine.
people I love that metaphor. Sometimes people find themselves in your
Yeah.
position as a chief medical officer or similar type of role, but like maybe they don't know all the investigators, they don't know the space. How do you go about
Yeah.
and you don't necessarily have time to meet all 1,000 doctors in the country and they won't necessarily give you the time. How do you actually find those people in the biotech time frame that you need to?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm in a very fortunate spot where, I've been on both sides of this. So I've spent most of my career among this small community of, 1,000 or so. There's not that many doctors that specialize in cardiomyopathy and heart failure and genetic cardiomyopathy. So I've gotten, these are all, known them for years. So for in this specific space, it's not hard because I know the folks real
Yeah.
well, and we're all on the same front lines of trying to figure this stuff out. It's been really fun because, a decade ago, when I was going into heart failure, along with my colleagues, we were called the palliative care, the oncology of cardiology. Oh, you're going to sit around and just watch people die, and they say, oh, you're going to poke people till they die, draw their blood till there's nothing you can do. And
Yeah.
the surgeons can do you're doing nothing. And so all of us who are studying the genetics and doing the work in the labs and seeing patients and putting in the hours and grinding it out, we were ignored. And that's just not in my space. That's in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, amyloid disease, right? 10 years ago in amyloid, people
Right.
were like, why are you paying attention to this disease? Like you treat it with green tea and then like there was nothing. Like, why are you, Eric, you
Yeah.
shouldn't even be seeing these amyloid patients. Now you show up to American Heart Association, it's everywhere.
Right.
People didn't even know how to, or I used to joke Danon was like, people thought it was yogurt. Like then my mom, like, what are you doing? Like no cardiologist knew what it was. So now it's kind of like you have this community of doctors, small community that have been studying this for 10 years.
Yeah.
I think a lot of pioneers in HCM, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, amyloidosis, dilated. Now that community, we're all close. So getting them on board, they all want to innovate. Like this is like, all right, now now we've given them the keys to the car. Gene therapy, precision therapy is like amazing.
Yeah,
Um,
that's amazing.
yeah.
As we're closing out here, you're clearly very busy between your biotech and academic work, but I did a little bit of research, and I think you have managed somehow to find time for other things because I learned that you once won an episode of a cooking show called Dinner
Yeah.
Spinner, and if my
Yeah.
research is correct, you cooked an award-winning pork rollatini. I'm just curious about the story there. How did you get into cooking? You must, that must not have been your first time cooking that. I'd love to hear
Yeah.
a little bit more about that.
Yeah. It was like a 2 a.m. thing where there was like something on social media. I couldn't sleep, like looking for home cooks for a cooking competition and send us an essay on why you think you should be on our show. And I saw that essay. I'm like, I'm going to be on the show because I could bring in my, work in cardiology. How I want to cook healthy foods for my family, and, all this stuff is epidemic. And so I wrote this essay, told my wife. My wife was like, "Oh, you're so full of S. Like you eat bird, like, like you're on the show, but she, I've always loved to cook and grew up cooking. And so, and stuff like that. But so I wrote the essay, got on the show. And it was like a surreal, one day experience where came up with this, the sponsors made us use pork as a product. So I wanted to make something healthy with pork. So I, cutlets and cut it and stuffed it with vegetables and I had to do this thing. I will tell you, the funniest part is like, I didn't realize there's food stylists on these shows. So you cook the food, and it was my food, put it in the oven. The chefs, the judges get your food. But meanwhile, they have a food stylist make your recipe on this show and put that in the oven. So, I did cook the food.
So they don't trust you to plate it. They plate it themselves.
They don't trust you to plate it. So I take this food out of the oven in the camera, and it's like, Michelin plating. Like perfectly titled. And I look at it like, I didn't realize they did this. I'm like, oh, so I took out my phone and took a picture because I'm like, oh, this is amazing. But there is that truth. So it's very televised experience, but it was amazing. Yeah. And I love to try to cook and invent, as healthy as I can. I cook a lot of breads and pizzas now, like a lot of people during COVID went to that. And so
I love that. So if we have any home cooking show producers listening, can they reach out to you? Are you ready to do it again?
Yeah, I've always been tempted. If things go well, maybe I'll just end up, throwing dough in some sliced pizza place back in New York where I grew up. Then I'll made it.
Where did you do the show? Was it in LA or San Diego?
Nice. Mm-hmm. Yeah, LA. Yeah.
Yeah, if you grew up in New York, then you have a high bar for pizza, probably. So we'll.
Yeah, that's correct.
Well, Eric, thank you. This was so much fun. I learned a lot about certainly cardiomyopathy, Alzheimer's disease, gene therapy, and a little bit about your home cooking at the end. So thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, it was great chatting with you, Patrick.
If people want to follow your work, follow Lexeo, the Lexeo website is lexeotx.com. Is there anything else you'd like to call out? Any big focus points for 2025 for you and the team or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to continue to deliver. I think this is a big year for us. We have 3 clinical stage programs and 2 really exciting preclinical programs. So this is the year of really phenomenal fundamental work in the clinic. So I'm excited to see what's next for us.
Yeah, amazing. Congratulations. You had a couple of big results in 2024 or 2023 as well. So I'm excited. Yeah. Like you said, the gene therapy toolkit is perfect for the kinds of diseases you're going after. So I think in 2030, we're going to look back on this period of time, and it's going to be pretty amazing what you've been able to do for patients. So congratulations.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you again. And thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time. That wraps up this week's episode of the Genetics Podcast. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our guests for sharing their valuable insights and experience. And thank you as well to our listeners, as always, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's talk, the number one thing I would really appreciate from you is if you could share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it as well. We would also really appreciate if you could subscribe to our show and give us a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Both of these things help us become more visible when people search for genetics and precision medicine podcasts. And we're always eager to hear from you. Please reach out to us with any questions or feedback on social media. You can find Sanogenetics on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit sanogenetics.com. Finally, a big thank you to the team behind the scenes who make all this possible. In particular, Amy Cousins and Sonia Shah, who produced the show, and James Pierce from Selected Frequencies, who handles the audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.